would like to first acknowledge that this event takes place on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. I'm Silvana D'Angelo. I'm the Artistic Director for Vancouver Art Book Fair. And last year, Denise from Or Gallery approached me about launching the Northwest Coast series at Vancouver Art Book Fair. And we had a chat with Dana and Skeena Reese last year. And this year we wanted to sort of revise with a panel discussion. I feel personally connected to the project because arriving in Vancouver 10 years ago, I thought that this community was really interesting, and it was something I hadn't been as noticeable back on the East Coast. The Northwest Coast series highlights the West Coast as a hospitable place to foster the work of First Nations women, and specifically have them self-describe their practices. I'm introducing Dana Claxton. She's an artist, head of the Visual Arts Program at UBC, and recent recipient of the Nitition Award. Thank you, Dana.
Thank you. So I guess I'll just say a few things about NWC. So good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge, of course, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people, as well as the spirit of the mountain and the new snow that's on the mountains today. It was lovely to see. I'm grateful to the Or Gallery and to Denise Rayner for inviting me to make and curate this book project, and to everyone who worked on the book, Robin Mitchell Cranfield, I'm not sure if she's here, for her lovely design and her ongoing graciousness, because it took a while to get it on. When you're dealing with 5 books, it's not just, even though they're precious, there's still 5 of them. So I'm very grateful for her work on that, as well as the Jacqueline Arndt for copy editing, and proofreader Kate Noble, and to also the people who made the lovely rhizome covers. They're so lovely to touch and hold, and I just think that they're gorgeous in the best possible way. So I'm thankful to everybody who's touched these books to make them, and also to the Vancouver Book Fair for having a space to talk about the work, as well as for independent publishing. So we have 4 artists here today. Next to me, Roxanne Charles. Then we have Morgan Asoyuf, Nee Green. Then we have Marika Swan and Brenda Crabtree. And then last year, this was Skeena Reese's. So thank you all for being here with me. And I was thinking earlier when I was looking at these is that, I felt that really that you trusted me to make this, and with everybody. So I appreciate that you trusted me. Also, just to give a bit of context to these is that, so NWC, of course, for me is a play on words with hip hop culture. So that's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking of NWC. And also there was an attempt to think about place-based agency here in Vancouver, and local art makers as well. And I considered matrilineal societies, which most Indigenous communities are. And so when the Canadian state criminalized Indigenous cultures, they also foreclosed on Indigenous women's roles in tribal governance. So that's something that I think has to deeply be considered here. And of course, Morgan, and everybody can, but Morgan talks about this in her essay. And what is so lovely is that these are the voices of the artists talking about their work, as opposed to an academic or a scholar. And not that we don't love academics and scholars, but also sometimes we also want to hear the artist's voice, right? So of course the great thing is that many cultures didn't foreclose on their own matriarchs. And so despite whatever lateral damage has happened, but also, as we know, with lateral damage, there's also lateral love, to borrow that term. And so matriarchs exist very much so. And Brenda and Morgan and Roxanne can speak to these things. With Brenda's and Roxanne's work, is their use of cedar, I think, is within the realm of the type of, I don't want to use words, I was thinking about what feminine and masculine work is, but I think it's within the realm of women productions with cedar. And also Morgan uses cedar, of course, with her carvings and in other ways as well. So thinking about the materiality of the Northwest Coast with cedar, and then how long people have been printmaking. I remember one printmaker in the late, I think it was sort of the mid-'80s, said to me that printmaking was like printing your own money for Northwest Coast printmakers to feed their families. So they were printing their own money. So I'm thinking also about the materiality of what they're using. That's also very specific to the Northwest Coast, and so how they're each, because I think there's these these collective commonalities between everybody, but also each has their own individual culture, and so how those aesthetic properties enter into the production of their work and these lovely books. So I'm getting sidetracked here. So thinking about form, right? Thinking about form as well and the storytelling. So these volumes are a kind of, I don't know, there's a continuation of matrilineal knowledge, if you'll allow me to say that, and help me out in a minute here. So there's a type of knowledge keeping within these as through the visual field, and it also, there's a placement of Indigenous women's contemporary art and historical traditional knowledge, and I think Brenda used the term contemporary traditional in her work within the practice, but further placing all of that within the art discourse of Vancouver, which is pretty vast, and if we think if there is a particular Vancouver art discourse, I would say. So it places it within that, but also, of course, within then the larger national scene of art and then the international scene of contemporary art. So I was thinking, even though I haven't asked this in advance to the artists, just so you know, I'm just asking them now. So I'm just thinking about how their art making sustains cultural knowledge and how how aesthetic properties are within in the work that we'll see in the book. So however you might want to address anything or talk about your work, let's talk.
Is anyone ready to go? Sorry, what was the question again? how the culture is sustained through the work, kind of? I think, the culture is kind of more than sustained in the work. And one thing that I would say is, I do kind of consider myself as an academic and a scholar. I know I'm not, I haven't been through university for those subjects, but I've been studying Tsimshian culture my whole entire life. I am a huge bookworm, so I definitely do a lot of researching, and I'm able to mix that with one-on-one adach and stuff with our people's stories and histories, and I feel like artists hold that place as historians in a lot of ways in our culture, because everything is so interconnected. All our histories, our land use, basically everything represented in our lives pre-contact, these were histories. And so I think most artists tend to study a lot these histories and learn a lot of it and hold a lot of it for the community as well. And I think that it's interesting through creating the pieces. So I recently have done some frontlets, and through the work of doing those, I've had so much research and information and knowledge that's been put upon me and given to me. And so I just have it. Doing the physical works also brings you to a new level of knowledge keeping, and you're able to share that again with other people within your community. So the pieces are actually teaching us as well as we're doing them.
Thank you for that. And of course, there Indigenous scholarly, as I'm taking that, equating that, of course, to Western academics.
Yes, yeah.
Just to clarify that, right?
I
think that's really interesting what you said about the work teaching you. So I was a single mother, separated on my own, decided to go back to school for financial reasons. I never considered that I could go to university, even though I could have. It was something I didn't see and something I didn't think was possible. I wanted to be like a totem pole carver, carving house poles, masks, and I couldn't do that. Like, I couldn't support my family doing that. So what my uncle suggested was that if I go back to school, then I could have a living allowance, I could have something to support me, I could eventually go on to get a better, secure, more, I don't know, stable job or something. Ironically enough, it was nothing about money. Like, I ended up just going and working in a dispensary store for $16 an hour just to find some space, like a space of healing, because of everything was so kind of heavy. But what I found is I didn't intend to bring the culture into the school. Like, I didn't go there to, like, sometimes you can look at things and think it's exploitative even when you look at the work. And so I'm always really respectful that I have conversations with my grandmother, whether it's about sexuality and the depiction of women and why I think it's important, like kind of facing like violence against women in our cultures and claiming sexuality and claiming space and being proud of who we are. So the culture kind of just came into the space, like it's a part of you and who you are.
It's powerful. It drags you along sometimes. You don't even know. You're like, wait, how did I end up here? You're like, okay, all right, I hear you.
Yeah, and I always, I've always had this strong resistance to the school. Like, I remember reading grade 8 social studies textbooks and having them, the color that they were colored in, the shade, the language that was used, and I found it very upsetting because my grandmother's the closest person to me. And I thought, this is not true what you're saying about Indigenous people as this blanket, as this is what we are, and we have something to be ashamed of. So from a young age, I really started fighting back in high school that, like, I'm not going to social studies. And so in Surrey, we started a First Nations program out of that because a lot of us didn't want to be in the space. So we started looking at what could make us be more comfortable in the space. And I didn't think I'd have to face that as like a 25-year-old mother going into university. I thought university is going to be this really progressive space and people just carried the same knowledge as you. And then I found the same thing. It was really an uncomfortable space for me. So through the work, I started just creating like almost like these cleansing kind of ceremonies, just like interacting in space, like, because I find like we're depicted as a cost, we're depicted as social stereotypes, like just angry, violent, alcohol addiction, like a lot of really negative things all the time, or like protesting, like we want more, like look what we already have. And so working in the realm of contemporary art, when you're trying to talk about environmental issues, you're trying to talk about this thing and your First Nations perspective and your culture is coming into it. I was just trying to think of ways that we could interrupt space, like do something that would stop people, maybe make them more inquisitive, like more self-reflexive. And doing that, I found I needed my own healing as well, like dealing with these heavy subject matters that keep popping up and aren't going away. So I started kind of having these ceremonies, like, and I used kind of the model of performance art to do that, where Anna Black, she worked with Marina Abramovich, and she was one of my profs at Kwantlen, but she's the one who kind of brought in the body. It wasn't like we're unfamiliar with the body or voice or any of those things, but in the context of contemporary art, that was something that was new to me. And so I found it like so easily at home, like that was kind of my avenue. So, and it's not that I'm comfortable doing it. It's like there's this thing inside your body, right? And it's uncomfortable until you push yourself beyond it. And then the only way you get the relief is if you actually do something. So that's kind of how the ceremony started to come into the space.
She does a lot of public performance as well with her weavings and her contemporary art that have weaving aspects to them. Marika?
I don't know about answering your question, but just as I'm thinking, as you both are talking, I just for me, right now, like my work has a lot to do with studying a lot of like our ancestral treasures, so going into different kinds of like institutional museum spaces and traveling to see those collections and touch those collections and really connect with a part of what I feel like is like my artist education. And I feel like I feel like really grateful for like this generation that came before me, my dad and all his contemporaries that were mostly men that you know, reclaimed the carving arts and all these like incredible like prints that have become so popular. But I felt like a really large absence of like a female voice, like a woman's story, and wanting to see like more of that. And I don't have that same like, my dad is always like a really like technical carver and really wanted to learn like the exact like refined, most perfect West Coast form and really sought and honed that. But I'm more interested in like the story and the meaning of the story and the teaching and what's relevant to me now. And celebrating my experience as a woman, you know, like when I gave birth to my daughter, it was like the most transformative, incredible experience of my life. And I was like, I want to see this. I want to see
And
this.
it exists. It's just not what's been focused on till this point. Now that there's a lot more female artists coming up, you know, which in some ways I feel like it's really interesting because a lot of my mentors were actually taught by Frida Diesing, who was a female artist. And I'm like, I kind of feel like they're kind of like passing that to me, like, hey, like let's like uplift these women too, because it's kind of a misconception that there wasn't women carvers pre-contact. Through my research, I have found multiple women carvers who carved totem poles, who were also chiefs and matriarchs. So that was existing among Tsimshian, Gitsan, and all sorts of nations. But it's kind of become like this, like, oh no, there wasn't female carvers, but there was, you know. And so, and if you actually, when you're studying the art form, there's so many representations of very female stories, of birth, of bloodlines. Like they'll carve actual babies into the stomachs, you know. Like there's things in just the 2D design that are representative of the ribs and the womb and like the coloring. It's so interlinked.
And breastfeeding.
Yeah, like these things were in our art form. So and it is there. You have to find it though. But yeah, it's really interesting. As like I said, as the art teaches you, as you're working with it, you know, and it's sort of dragged me in a direction. So the direction it sort of dragged me in is like the research about the matriarchy, because a lot of nations are matrilineal, but Tsimshians in particular are matriarchal. And so like there's things that because there isn't female carvers that just aren't really being looked at in the same way. Like, so one of my interests of study moving forward from this show that I've been working on, which is a lot about the matriarchy and how that's represented through the art form, because there's a lot of undertones inside of just like how our art form looks that represents that, but a lot of people just don't know, and it's hard to find the information. And like I said, like I don't go around asking for information. That's not how I learn. I work and I make myself available, and it's put on me when the people feel like it's time for me to receive that information. So that's kind of how I've learned within my culture. But yeah, so so moving forward, it's like I'm looking at like, when's the last time somebody carved a libret? You know, like these are things that people wouldn't maybe look at if it's not something that interests them as much. But for me, that side of the history is very interesting. Obviously, my great grandmother was a woman with a libret who would just like stop meetings when you put the libret down and that meeting was over. So there's some really interesting stories and histories that just, you know, they definitely need to be spotlighted and explored. Because I think so many women do feel that connection to the art. That's like a really deep connection. And the history's there too, but it's just maybe not, it takes maybe people like us to bring that focus there, you know.
So because in Marika's book is that there was this lovely, and I hope I've got the language right, so excuse me, but it was a headpiece, and then there was the cloth inside the headpiece, and I remember we were all looking at the images. There was something about that sweat, and I think you even mentioned it, the sweat that was in that headpiece, and that it wasn't an object, it wasn't an artifact, it was, you know, it was a cultural belonging that belonged to a people and that belonged to a person, and that person, you know. wore and danced these things.
I think the other thing to consider as well is like we can think about like the matriarchal kind of bloodline, because I believe there's things like the minute I got in a racing canoe, I knew I was built to be in that racing canoe. Or when I started weaving, how I can just vanish into this thing and do it without thinking, and like I can make it do whatever I want to do. Like it's not something that I'm taught, but it's just something like felt and embodied that through generations and generations. Like
It's like genetic and it's in
Yeah.
your soul.
because my great great grandmother was a master weaver, and she wove this beautiful violin case, and I was making all these really strange contemporary things, and then so when I came across that violin case, I was like, why did no one ever tell me? But they just assumed that I knew. So I know that we come from this long line, and the bloodline and all that, but something also to consider is how like all the trauma and the intergenerational trauma and the things that Indigenous women have had to face are pretty horrific. And I think for men, that there is this kind of toughness and not as openness. So a lot of times the women are the ones supporting those men as well. Like they're kind of feeling for them, or so I think that's what really makes really powerful Indigenous women so vocal here. And like when you've had enough, you've just had enough. Like I always think like it's going to be a really sad day when with all this resource extraction and stuff, and when things go down, because I think Indigenous people don't have much to lose. There's already been so much suffering and death and loss and trauma and that sort of thing. It's kind of like bred in you to fight or to survive.
Right, you don't have a choice. There's no choice in the matter.
Yeah.
Brenda, which makes me think about your, in each one of these precious, precious volumes, there was a moment where I was completely, had that moment. And of course, there was a moment in everybody's, but you know, in terms of trauma and testimony and, you know, interior, I mean, these go pretty deep. You know, they go pretty deep in what everybody's talking about, and especially with your book. Do you want to talk about your work?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it, although I have to say, if anyone reads this, I'm a self-professed poor public speaker, and I say that at the very beginning, but anyway, I'll try. So I come from a very small band in the interior. I'm a member of the Spuzum band in Clackamook territory. And I was the first generation to ever attend post-secondary university in our family. My father comes from a family of 17 children from Spuzum. So it was a really big deal for me to go to university, and it was even a bigger deal to end up at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. And I'm the director of Aboriginal programs here, and I absolutely have the best job at Emily Carr. And the reason for that is I get to work with Aboriginal students that come into this university with a variety of expectations, with a variety of histories. Some of them themselves are first generation students at post-secondary, and we all had this common thread of we have the history, a lot of us, history of marginalization, history of economic marginalization, and we try and form a cohesive group and support each other, and we learn from each other. And I can tell you that I've learned far more from my Aboriginal students than I ever learned at university. And it's pretty magical. And then what started to happen was I teach drum making, I'm a basket weaver, and my grandmother was a master basket weaver, and she taught me. And so I was just weaving sort of with technical precision, like how fine could I weave, how diverse could my patterns become, and I found that at the same time I'm working full-time with the students who are often going through emotional stress, and so not wanting to trigger any of their healing practice or upset their art practice in any way. I tended to shy away from the politics. So the repressive politics of history, And then what I found was, for me, it was cathartic just to transfer that political activism into text in my art practice. So that's how I got to writing text on my drums, What Becomes of the Brokenhearted, Kill the Indian in the Child, and it was just sort of this, it just happened.
It pulled you.
It
The
pulled
art
me,
firm was
yeah.
like, you're going this way.
I always say the materials will tell you what they want.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Marika?
Yeah, I feel pulled. I think my title of my thing is getting pulled back into place. Yes, that's what my title is. Yeah, obsessed, bewitched, possessed, obsessive.
Yeah.
My art practice is definitely like my form of healing, so I have like my other things that I do. I can relate a little to what you were saying in terms of like my community work and the things I do in the community, and then my art practice is like my space to enter into and to do that heart work and to maybe kind of meditate or dream, have hopes, and heal, so that I can kind of get back out there and do that other work that I really want to do. I choose to, I really made a conscious choice not to have my art practice be like my full-time bread and butter. It's an awkward place with the commodification of coastal art to kind of have and I think we all kind of walk that line and try to strike that balance of what's comfortable for us in terms of like what we're willing to do for money and what we're not, and how do we protect this like little sacred
Reconciling like a
space.
spiritual art form with commercialism. It's difficult.
Yeah. And so for me, I've kind of like really tried to segregate it and protect it, and do other things, work on other trades, to kind of protect that space.
Keep it pure.
Try to
Yeah.
defend it. I don't know.
Because, Morgan, because you have
Yes.
sort of two practices, don't you?
Kind of, yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Like, do you mean like within the commercial industry? Because
Yeah, commercial work or cultural
Yeah,
and
so-
cultural work.
like I'm actually like a big part of my practice is cultural work. I call it halate work. So it's doing crest work for the owners of the crests. So I do make money from that. I do get paid for that, and I do that work for individuals and for the feast house and all sorts of different artists and stuff. But I definitely give priority to those type of orders because I prefer to do work for title holders. But it doesn't mean that they can't still like give me something financially, because I have to support myself and my daughter still. And then on the commercial side, I don't deal much with like commercial galleries, but I do have like a cast line, and I do work with like nonprofits and stuff, and I do have some higher end patrons. So I've tried to really foster like patrons where it's like basically they give me money and I do my work and they support that because they want to see what I'm doing, and they would have an opportunity to own the piece, but I would require that it's lended whenever I need it for like shows and for cultural use or whatever else. So I've just done what I can to find a way, because my work's very expensive too. Like goldsmithing is one of just the most expensive industries to be in. The wood carving is maybe not as expensive dollar-wise, but it's very time-consuming. So in order to be able to fund my work to get to the level that I need, it's like I have to still have money coming in. I simply couldn't purchase all the materials and pay all the people that I have to work with. So that's how I've sort of found a way to fund it, where it's able to still be used by people and it's able to be seen and used by folks in the community and stuff. But yeah, I definitely, like, if I'm doing like an item, like a piece of jewelry for sale, I definitely always prioritize like community members, which is, and I consider Northwest Coast community like all of BC, because I've worked with nations and done crest work for everywhere from Coast Salish, Kwakwaka'wakw, Wet'suwet'en, Tsimshian, Haida. So it's really cool when you do crest work that much, because you learn so much about each system and all the crests and who owns what and how it was passed and what all the histories are for each specific one. There's so many specific crests. So I've always been like very careful, and I know some other artists that work primarily, say, in like the gallery industry and stuff, that they're also careful to not portray crests that are owned by families. So instead of saying like, this is a raven with a sun in its mouth, they may just do like flying ravens, you know, which isn't really a crest. It's an artistic depiction using form line. So I think there is ways to like wiggle around it if you're like very conscious of what you're doing. I don't think that everybody cares as much about that, but for me, I feel really strongly about that. So, and I think that like as female artists too, we kind of have to fight to be like funded at that level. That say like a commercial artist might fund like a famous male artist to do these huge projects, and we're over here like, oh, like I don't really feel comfortable with like selling cultural, you know, identity. And so you might miss out on that type of thing where your art form might be as talented. So I think we need to push to get that funded, but just maybe in a different way where that we're able to still feel comfortable with how it's being paid for, promoted, and used.
Well, I think about all your works, because with Brenda's basket techniques, weaving techniques, there's something very, I don't know for what the language is, it would be very Salish designs within those.
Yeah, fairly
and
traditional.
very traditional designs. And then with Marika's imagery, and you know, that woman swimming with the whale. I mean, you know, she comes from a whaling people, you know, these are whale hunters. And so when I see that image is so lovely. But then there's also elements of New Channel's work in there. If we think of New Channel's art, you know, we don't see a lot of, for one, we don't see a lot of New Channel's art because of, I think, the domination of sort of, I don't know if the right word is domination, but just, you know, Haida work. And so, sorry, I'm giggling. And, you know, so even New Channel, you know, carving, I mean, you know, that the way the New Channel do that nose, nobody does the nose like New Channel art. I remember one person said they're going to make New Channel art, and I'm like, you have to be New Channel to make New Channel art. You know, you know, you can't be.
But that information is like not all that readily available.
No,
like I
it's
had
not.
to like really go out on a pilgrimage to find that out. Like it's awesome to see like Frida Giesling and that support of the community up north. For me, I had to go literally find it myself. And now that I've seen like hundreds and hundreds
Same with
of masks.
Simshan art. I literally have to just go and like dig it out of wherever, you know?
So now you can identify what New Channel art
I
is.
could, now that I've seen that many, now I can start to but it's-
Identify the stylistic similarities and stuff.
Yeah.
And I do know actually other female and two-spirit New Channel folks that are studying these same things. So there's definitely a lack of like a public sort of space for it and for people to come together more, right? Because there is other people interested in this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then thinking about Roxanne using traditional materials of cedar weaving, but then making these performative sculptural.
I was just thinking when everyone's making money off art, I'm paying to store my art. Because everything's so big. I never really make art with the intention of selling it. It's always a response to space. So if I get asked to do a show somewhere, then I'm usually taking into account that space, issues that are going on, things that I'm going through, that sort of thing, and then kind of allow the space to create the work.
That's so interesting to me. It's so different from doing physical pieces and then being like making the space work around that, you know?
Yeah. It's like I just did a big, huge project. Probably the largest one I did was at the Museum of Vancouver for There's Truth Here. So it was for Capture Festival, and it was a response to the museum's archival photographs of St. Mary's Residential School where my grandma went. So keeping that in mind, like even the whole opening night, I was just concerned about my grandma, and she was just having so much fun playing with like all the elders. They got stuck in the elevator. They're just like a big hoot wherever you go all the time. They'll just make friends like right away. And but the whole time I found like I was concerned about her and how she was interacting with the space, and just so I always like I'm just considering those things. Who's going to be in the space? Like, how do you speak about difficult subject matter in a way that's going to be impactful to people who need to feel that impact, and then not triggering to those people who have gone through all these sort of things? so space is always really important to me, and but I find with that, like, you'll get, for surviving kind of, you'll get you'll get money to make the project, and then you'll get money to exhibit the project, and then at the end you own the project, but then you have to find
But then what do you do
somewhere
with
to
it, right?
store
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
So
Well, then in about 10 years from now, you sell it to a museum.
Yeah.
so I've been lucky enough to have, I have 2 pieces in the collection of the Surrey Art Gallery. So that's kind of nice, and I've thought about donating some of the other larger pieces, because things take days to install, like they're pretty big. But so for me, I do a lot of education, and I'm like crazy. I've done paramedic training, I've been a firefighter, I've just like, I get bored, I think, really easily. I like to stay busy. I was loving the job at the cannabis shop because I'm like researching all this stuff. Like, I like to be distracted by new information, and so for me, I go and I do education. I got tricked into doing truth and reconciliation work for Brandon Gabriel's like, could you fill in for me doing this thing with the Vancouver Parks? I'm like, sure. I'm like, I thought we were going to make art. I didn't know we were like doing, why are we facilitating truth and reconciliation? So I kind of do that sometimes, and and that's how I do it. I talk about like, why are we the ones doing it when this is kind of still happening? And so I like to kind of bounce around and do different things, and I have a studio from home that I work on, and I find, like you were saying with the healing, the cedar work for me is so healing.
Yeah.
Like, and part of the work that I enjoy most is actually funerary art. Like, I will spend so much time, because it is like healing, it's therapeutic, and you're making something for someone, and that is gonna go into a fire, and it's just gonna disintegrate.
It
in
feels
front of
like
you.
one of the highest honors to me also. Like I told you that I do work throughout sort of BC for different nations, and so like when somebody passes, I will sometimes get called, and I know a lot of other artists do this, and you go to that nation and you know, you might be painting the casket, or you might be designing the headstone, or doing some sort of memorial, you know, items for the family, and then it's all sort of like integrated into the feast work and stuff. But like, to me, that's like just the most like, it's precious, it's so precious.
Yeah.
Because you're being called to like memorialize this person, and that's like kind of like the highest form to me.
There's so much love and energy that goes into it. That's just a pure energy.
It's so pure, yeah. It's
Well, it starts just listening to it, I have to say, because it's residing within the realm of sacred knowledge, which, you know, if we think about what contemporary art is, and then indigenous cultures, and then indigenous cultural practices, and then sacred knowledge that comes into this conversation. You know, it's a complex world.
And through my work too, like, I don't care if anybody sees it as, like, it's not intended to be a spectacle for the viewer. It's everything that has gone into that work is always like sacred from the beginning. Like, taking the cedar from the tree, like the energy that goes into it, whether it's difficult subject matter that's happening today, there's still prayer and energy going into it. And for me, it's like reclaiming those spaces for spiritual spaces, even though the viewer might not be aware of that. Like, it doesn't need to be talked about or there. For me, it's present in the work. And I believe too, like, I'm trying to navigate right now, and I've taken a year to kind of complete my master's, because I didn't like the framework, and I didn't like how I'm supposed to look at myself through these lenses and not acknowledge walking through the downtown east side to come to this higher place of learning, and all this sort of things I found really problematic. But for me, I'm having like a completion ceremony there. And ceremony is so important to me, because all of those objects, way back, we look thousands of years, these were political objects, they were spiritual objects, like they're like living kind of beings, and they document things in life. And so when I look at a lot of our work today, I still see those things. Those things are present in those same fashions, right? So when I look at First Nations artwork, I don't necessarily look at it with this Western sort of ideology that we put on it.
Well, I have to say something about that because that's so interesting because I also consider the pieces to be living, and like the literal kind of translation of like a halate artist is someone who creates living documents, living documents of law or living documents of history and stuff. So it's even within our language, it's like ingrained, like you're creating like life, like these pieces are alive, and so I find it really interesting. I feel like that comes through in so many different art forms within Northwest Coast culture.
I even sing too. I have this transformation figure that's like 10 feet tall. It's made out of garbage, and I sing to it. Like when I put them away,
All
I'm
my
like
pieces have been
wrapping them
sung
up
to
in
by
these
so many people.
blankets
Yeah,
and stuff, right? So it's not necessarily
they're
all
alive. They want
traditional
to.
material either. Yeah.
They want to hear you and be sung
I'm like,
to.
you'll be coming back out again, like tell me
Yeah.
this.
That's nice.
Now, is there, I think this might be the caterer, sorry.
I love it.
Okay, I'm gonna just call you right back. Now, are there questions or comments from our lovely
Audience.
audience?
Lori?
Thank you for that talk. I wanted to pick up on a phrase that Dana mentioned in the introduction about place-based agency, and I was wondering if any of you could speak about the way that you feel like place enhances your agency through making your work, whether that's maybe like gathering materials or like being or responding to place with each work, or like how do you feel like this place or like Northwest Coast kind of like enhances your agency?
I could just respond to that really briefly. Definitely working at Emily Carr, the artistic energy that I'm surrounded with every day, and the inspiration from the Aboriginal students definitely inspires my work, and just the day-to-day support that I get from faculty, staff, and students, it just makes you be able to move forward, I think, with your art practice. And for me, just talking about speaking to your work, and I don't know if anyone here owns a drum, you'll know that you can sing to your drum, and the drum will definitely sing back because of the humidity. If you've got a drum,
Yeah, they do that.
right, they create.
You'll hear
they
like a
moan,
boom
they-
from the other room. You're like, hey, what?
Yeah. So definitely everything that I work with comes from the earth. So, we're harvesting the cedar tree, we're harvesting the cedar roots, the bark, the boughs, the wood. I mean, cedar truly is a tree of life for West Coast people. And I'm just part of the application of text in my woven pieces, or I'm just terribly afraid that someday there's going to be some historical amnesia, that somehow maybe my great-great-grandchildren won't know about residential school, or won't know about nutritional experiments in residential schools. And so the text that I put on these pieces, I think whether they end up in garage sales or thrift stores or whatever, I want it to be an object made well enough that someone will recognize maybe the materials.
Something
But
that
I
physically
want
exists in the world.
Something that physically exists, but I also want the text to jog someone's memory to
Interesting.
maybe reflect. And so that's how this space really supports me in that way.
Yeah, I feel really lucky. I live at home. I moved home about 9-10 years ago, and I feel very lucky that I can live at home. There's a lot of people that, for safety reasons or financial reasons or family-based reasons, whatever, are not able to kind of live in that home space, and it's a huge source of just energy and power in my life that I can go and spend time in our old village sites and feel the energy of a place that's been inhabited for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It's a very special, spiritual, emotional experience. So it's a huge wellspring of healing and inspiration, and also just embracing my place in this like lineage, this line, and acknowledging how far that reaches back is incredible. Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yes, it's very difficult for artists to not find themselves being complicit, like in the dark forces of like capitalism. Like, you know, we are in the Rennie Hall, right? And Emily Carr, which unfortunately, because I graduated from Rennie Carr Villa campus, but Emily Carr is a P3. It's a private partnership, private-public partnership. And that instrument was created in the United States and was stuck into NAFTA because they knew that Canada would be very difficult for Canada to privatize its healthcare. So a P3 was created as kind of like a crowbar to privatize Canadian healthcare. But then, you know, after a few years, they're like, hey, it's working pretty good with healthcare, so why not open it up to like, you know, schools, right? So Emily Carr is a public-private partnership, which was an instrument created in the United States to privatize education. So, you know, not that there are public conversations happening in the car, but privately, people are really starting to ask, is art actually the first and foremost thing that is happening at Emily Carr? Or is that when they privatize as P3, that every single time they do this public-private partnership, they're always learning dozens of new ways to make the next art institution. Like in Surrey, when they create, like they're trying to create that new, that's also going to be a P3. Right? So anything.
So, but what about it? Like, what about
Yeah, what's
that
the
within
question?
context
Sorry,
of, what about that within the context of NWC? Just so I understand what you're, are you
It's just
asking
like
us something, or?
Just like, you know, it was just a general statement.
Observation
like,
about-
you know, that it's hard to function as an artist today without being complicit in some of the darker forces of capitalism. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I think P3, it's getting pretty dark.
Well, I mean,
Like
I'll
you
say
did
as
before.
I'm not an Emily Carr artist, I did not go to school here. I did not go to school anywhere for my art. I do traditional apprenticeship. I have done some apprenticeship with a German goldsmith in a more school-like setting. So, I mean, I think there's a pretty, for Northwest Coast artists anyway, we have a pretty massive system that relies mainly on person-to-person apprenticeship. So we don't really participate in any sort of thing like this. Like, this is the first time I've been to Emily Carr. I've never been in here before. And so, yeah, it's really different for different people if they decide to go like a more academic route or not. I think maybe it's like pushing for things to be the way you want them within those spaces, but.
I can see where Dylan's coming from, like if we look at SFU Gold Corp, or we look at these sort of things. Like when I was at Kwantlen, they were trying to take money from Trans Mountain, right? But we wouldn't take money from a cigarette company. So I do think that we are really complicit in those things. Honestly, I do. I think that we need to be more vocal and more kind of pressing. But do I find it more problematic than the institution itself? Hell no. And so I think that's where, for me, it's really different, because I still find these like university spaces extremely assimilative. And it's like, well, if we could just abolish reserves and we can make First Nations people just be just like us, like, hello, that's assimilation. Like, as problematic as things may be,
Yeah.
there's, but I find I'm pressed with that every time I go into an institution where I'm studying, like, my master's, for example. It's like an interdisciplinary program. It's supposed to be so progressive. Artists are the most progressive, so when you question them on not being progressive, it's like super problematic, right? And so, like, I'm still studying Walter Benjamin. It's like you try to have these conversations about your perspective and point of view, and it's not welcome in the space. And unfortunately, those things have like real live impacts.
Yeah.
Like, great. Like on your stress of your system. For instance, like I think I might have fibromyalgia right now, just from dealing with like fighting your whole kind of life.
Yeah.
It feels like, right?
That's
I
really
think
tiring.
one of the key things in terms of like the relationship with capital and art, you know, because it's been going on for so long.
Yeah,
like
for
a
sure.
long time. But how also you can disengage with it, however implicit people might be, but you can disengage with it where it's not, where you're not always in the battle zone, always having to be in the
Mhm.
battle, you know, thinking of my own self, being the head of the art department that I love Western theory, I also love being in the Sundance Circle, right? Like I have all these sort of seemingly contradictions of being an Indigenous woman within a Western institution, but it's like how to be there as a warrior, but also know that you don't have to be in battle mode all the time, because it's exhausting.
And
to have
it gets
to, you know,
really
fight
tiring.
in the
People,
institution
yeah.
all the time.
People thinking that
Where-
it's us that has to always be doing all that work all the time too is like kind of exhausting. Like
Yeah.
other
So-
people can also do that.
And I think people do things in terms of whatever anti-capitalist kind of activism that's not always public as well, so. And nor do I think it has to be public all the time with those kind of implications that you're talking about. Any other questions about NWC? Yes.
You're talking, Morgan, a bit about space and not having the space sort of have these dialogues between women and Northwest Coast artists who are talking to each other about where the matrilineal matriarch is kind of within the work.
Yes.
I don't know, what would you think would be, like, what would you like to see in the future? Or what would you like to see to kind of manifest that?
Well, I think like us just having more space within the art form is very helpful. So like I have a show up right now at Bill Reed Gallery. That's brought a lot of people to me as well, and that's really cool. So I think just like continuing to push for like space within the art form in general, because that gives us empowerment where we're able to come together more, and where younger women are able to see like an opportunity also to enter in through that door. So I think that's really important. It's like I kind of like I'm just taking space, like I'm gonna take the space and then I'm gonna like make it friendly and make it safe for like young Indigenous artists, women, Two-Spirit folks that maybe don't have that space of voice in other parts of the art industry. I think it's just like it's all a step in the right direction. Like the book, it really just like promoting the book and promoting the show for me have been a lot about not just me, but about other people's voices, and allowing space within our industry for that type of engagement, and for people to sort of start coming together more that feel that way or that are interested in that. Because it's hard to like find other people that are interested in the same thing if there's nowhere that it's being presented or seen or talked about. People are at home thinking, oh, I really would like to know more about, matriarchal art, and there's no space for it, right? So how are you going to ever connect up more people? So I think like with any sort of movement, like you just have to kind of like push for it and promote that, and then like people who feel that way or that are interested in, you're going to end up talking to them, or it's just going to it starts to come together sort of organically. That's my attack plan anyways.
I think really similarly, like there's been a lot of people who've cleared the space for us to be here today, being as vocal as we are. There's a lot of strong people that came before us. So for me, one thing that I heard was just that some of the most innovative ideas come from those who are quiet, right? And so a lot of us will sit there and when you're in a space that is totally different from your understanding or way of being, it's even harder to kind of be more vocal. So my hope is just to just let all my crazy loose, like all of it, like everything go. And then I feel like that opens up space for other people. And I don't think,
where they're not like afraid of,
there'll be better ideas to come. It's just about creating that kind of this space. And I was really fortunate. I grew up in Semiahmoo, where I still live, so like place, being able to go to school. And my grandmother was the youngest sibling of 15, and she got married, and so she lost her status and became white. And so if it wasn't for her being her daddy's little girl and him being the chief in that community, she would have been displaced, and our lives would have been a lot different. Instead, he welcomed her husband into our community. He looked after her. I was fortunate enough to be raised there, and then from a lot of strong women. That my chief, the chief of Tsleil-Waututh, Maureen Thomas, is actually a Semiahmoo woman who was displaced from her community because he became the property of another nation. He became the property of another man. And same with Chiacton, my other cousin Glenda Campbell was the chief there. So we come from this really long matriarchal family, but also a long line of chiefs as well. And it's not like our culture is about giving, so a lot of my artwork is about giving. It's not about selling. I'll give, like I like to give. Giving feels good to me. When my great grandma and grandpa got married, they actually fought back and forth between Lummi and Semian was sending back canoes full of stuff with each other.
That's very native culture. We like to give.
Yeah, the wealthier you are, you're wealthy in spirituality, and
Yeah.
the wealthier you are, the more that you have to give,
Yeah.
and that's how you
Totally.
kind of share it, right?
Yeah.
And so it's, I think, to just speaking to the matriarchal aspect of that, it's, so I grew up with really like low self-esteem. My mom, I had a rough life growing up, right? And so I didn't really have a strong sense of self, but I had a really strong sense of community. And that's what made me who I am today, right? It's like, you have to watch how you carry yourself because of your grandma, your aunties, like all that. Not because you're afraid to get in trouble, because you have a deep respect and love for the love they've shown you. So. I hope that answered some.
Any final comments, anybody?
I just want to say thanks, Dana, for taking this on. It was a huge project for you to herd us all into writing. And when you first asked me, I thought, oh, I can't possibly. But it was really cathartic and really healing for me to put the words down on paper. So really, I'm really grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you. You good. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone.